Okay, we switched to English now for our keynote. So you probably saw his name on almost all presentations today being cited. Nathan Lane is one of the very important voices in the emerging interest in industrial policy and the academic research. So we're very, very happy to have you here today to speak to us on the European industrial policy, in particular in defense industry. And looking forward to your talk.
So thank you for having me here today. This is great, and I've kind of an impossible task ahead of me. The idea is to kind of think about what's going on in Europe right now. And the question that was originally posed to me was, and the question kind of a lot of us as economists kind of speculate about, and did speculate about, is, what is this European rearmament thing that's going on? Is this moment that we're in politically when it comes to military policy? Is this industrial policy? And you start looking at things, you start reading things, you start kind of opening up, and you start reading the names of the policies themselves, right? It's like, oh, this is clearly industrial policy. This isn't even a question. So how do we start thinking rigorously about this moment in front of us? How do we start thinking about these things not merely as military buildups and military industrial policy, but as industrial policy that's meant to do something much more, right? The principle of industrial policy is spillovers. That is something that has social value, social good. And of course, defense has social value, tremendously so, right? But how do we promote the larger kind of spillovers, the larger kind of welfare consequences and welfare increasing consequences that ought to come with any massive industrial policy, with any massive industrial policy that's currently being pursued? And something that is very new to me, right? If you had told me a couple of years ago that we would be seeing something like this in Europe, I would be perplexed, right? I would be, this is a very hard industrial policy. And the germs of this thing, as it emerged from, you could trace its lineage to 2021. The original instruments we started seeing evolve. As we saw kind of things change, as we saw the geopolitical shocks hit, we saw this policy emerge from something that we kind of tepidly referred to as industrial policy to something that was really clearly industrial policy. So much so that it was in the name, a defense industrial strategy, right? And so there's no question that this is industrial policy. I think there's no way to deny that. Any definition of industrial policy, this hits the definition, right? And of course, like a lot of industrial policies, this is hitting multiple things. Of course, this is like promulgated and emergent from political demands, geopolitical crises that are hitting us, that are hitting Europe. But of course, it's happening in the backdrop of a particular economic moment in Europe right now. A scepter is haunting Europe. That scepter is Draghi and Letta. If we accept what Draghi and Letta have said, right? And of course, we don't all agree with it. We can kind of mince words about particulars here. But if we kind of take their thesis at face value, which I am, an impetus of what I'm going to share today is going to take their statements at face value. That Europe faces a technological gap. It faces a competitiveness gap. It faces a gap when it comes to investment in innovation. If we take these things seriously and think about the role of industrial policy, in fact, the social role of industrial policy, specifically the social role of defense policy, right? Defense policy has the potential to address these things. It's not to short shift and say that the rearmament of itself isn't something we ought to worry about. But as economists, if we are worried about these larger implications, if we're worried about these larger phenomena, this larger economic crisis we see ourselves in, I think this gives us a compass rose for thinking about how to design industrial policy best, especially in this moment. And if there's evidence of industrial policy, specifically defense-oriented policy, working, there's evidence of its working. It's actually working in the dimensions that Europe needs. That is, the dimension of innovation and technology and industrial development as it speaks to investment in more high-tech industries, products, investment in catching up to the frontier for which it lags. And that's going to be my thesis today. I'm going to go through what are the levers of industrial policy? What are the components of the industrial policy that Europe faces right now? the supply side instruments, the demand side instruments, and how do we make these speak to the larger fundamental questions beyond rearmament too, alongside rearmament, but these larger questions and larger issues, these larger social issues that Europe faces right now. And so I'm really going to focus on the outcomes related to innovation and industrial policy, not just building tanks, not just building armaments, not just building and increasing capacity. Those things are first order, but how do we go beyond these things, right? And so I'm going to get really pedantic. I'm going to get almost textbook here. But what is industrial policy? I'm sure people parse these things and parse these ideas, but it's helpful. It's helpful for us. It's not because I'm a professor and I like being a pedant, but it's because if we think about industrial policy from a principled perspective, it's truly helpful, especially if we just look at it merely through the lens of, I'm a mainstream neoclassical economist. If we're principled in that view, industrial policy makes a lot of sense, and we can put some conditions and principles along how we think about this thing, right? Industrial policy is intentional state action that's meant to steer the structure of what occurs within an economy. It has specificity to it, it has intentionality to it, right? But we're reallocating things within an economy. Principally, of course, defense here in this case. And so there's no question that what we're facing and the policies that we read that relate to European rearmament are truly deeply imbued in industrial policy tradition. These things are no doubt industrial policy. We need shells, we need armaments, we need munitions for the conflict which might occur, the conflict they currently face, right? We need these industries. And of course, we need to also address the industrial, kind of daunting industrial task that sits in front of us from Draghi and others, posed by Draghi and Letta, but posed from also member nations around Europe. And if we kind of continue with our mainstream economics hat and our kind of banal mainstream economic lens by which we think about industrial policy, the justifications for industrial policy are really boring. They're boring. It's market failures. They're no different than the justifications of many policies that we teach in an Econ 101 class or in a public economics class. The justifications are really, really kind of no different, right? Textbook market failures. We allocate policy for which we think government interventions, that's key. There might be government failures, but areas for which we think government interventions matter. But there's nothing exotic about the justifications for industrial policy, though we as economists treat industrial policy as something that is exotic, right? But if you abstract away and kind of take a bird's eye view on what this phenomena is, these things are just market failures. The theoretical conditions, the theoretical arguments for industrial policy are basically like a lot of others. They're not the only justifications for industrial policy, but they're the ones we are principally concerned with. And of course, one reason, if you think about the history of defense production and the history of rearmament in industrialized and capitalist economies, or even non-capitalist economies, the defense industry and procurement is just riddled with market failures. They're implicit in kind of the defense realm, the defense industry, which is marked by these things. It's one reason why, if you take a step back, it's really hard to disentangle military production and rearmament from industrial policy, because often they're so enmeshed and so intertwined and so kind of interrelated. It's hard to peel apart these two things. Rearmament is industrial policy, and it's hard to read defense history. It's hard to read the history of rearmament experiences abroad and walk away from anything else. Like, these things are truly industrial policy, and deeply so. And there's an amalgam of market failures that imbue defense production. There's tons of them. But there's really two that are very salient. There are two that are very salient in the industrial policy making that we see with the European rearmament experience. But they're also just historically ubiquitous. This idea of capacity. This idea of the value of war readiness not being priced in the private market, in the kind of civilian normal state of the world, right? There tends to be underinvestment in things like resilience, right? There tends to be an emphasis on short-term costs, on the kind of short-run horizon, not merely from firms, not merely from the private sector, but also from ministries, right? And so there's an endemic issue of surge capacity, an endemic market failures around constructing and designing policies around surge capacity. You look at World War I, right? Britain faced a shell crisis. They were losing the war in World War I because of a shell crisis, because of a production crisis, because they hadn't addressed the market failure in surge production early on in the war that was residual from the Boer War. They hadn't addressed these things. They thought the market itself could take account for these things and expand enough armament and stockpile to secure the war on the Western Front. And it was very obvious by 1915 that was not the case. And again, that's just one example, but you read the history and like surge capacity, resilience, stockpiles, and how do we design industrial policy to overcome the market failures around these contingent capacity issues, right? They imbue the history of rearmament. Likewise with investment in technology. Even beyond moments of industrial conflict and industrial warfare and military conflict, right? We see the issue of underinvestment in technology and knowledge is this endemic issue when it comes to knowledge and innovation in economics. There's an endemic market failure where we believe the social optimum is not invested in, right? Because of the public goods nature of knowledge and the spillovers produced by knowledge production, the spillovers produced by technology that leaks from firms, that spreads through firms, and is in fact kind of contagious. For these reasons, why? Firms don't necessarily price innovation properly and thus underinvest in these things. It's not the only market failure that undergirds the issue of investment and investment in R&D, but it's a principal one, and it's one that imbues innovation economics. It's like the soul, the core market failure behind innovation economics, and in turn, it's this kind of a core issue of defense policy, right? Again, there's nothing unique about these two things, right? What's unique is that they're so ubiquitous and truly define military production. But in the realm of innovation and knowledge, these things are ubiquitous across any type of sector, right? We accept them. We accept these market failures. These are not exotic things. They might be applied to exotic things here, like missiles or tank productions, but these are no means kind of fancy or exotic or odd, idiosyncratic market failures that we face. Of course, there are some idiosyncratic market failures we face in the defense contract market. But it's to say these things are banal. These things are normal. And I'm going to kind of approach them with my economics hat on and say, like, these things, we have policies to address these things. And we have now emerging evidence as we start thinking about these things as properly and principally as economists. We see an emergent toolkit to actually address these market failures. And so my thesis today and in my paper is that the policies that the EU is deploying right now are policies for which we have emergent evidence of these things potentially working. These things could potentially work, both in realm of supply-side innovation policy, supply-side capacity policy, supply-side investment policy. These are things for which we do have proof of concepts for. And the more evidence we have, the more evidence we see that these things are something that can address not only European rearmament, but also the kind of daunting task that Draghi and Letta have posed, the daunting task that faces Europe right now. And so if we just kind of look at the industrial policies that have kind of emerged, the kind of the cornucopia, the word salad of things that kind of compose the current EU rearmament process, we look at those policies, we read them, we see the names, right? We understand them, we see a bunch of supply-side policies, and we see a bunch of demand-side policies, right? And we see policies that have gotten very, very explicit in their industrial policy aims, right? And I'm going to tackle both these kind of two wings of these policies, two wings of this rearmament policymaking, and I'm going to situate them in the empirical knowledge that is currently kind of emerging from economics. Again, these are not things that are exotic, but these are things for which we have empirical evidence around. We have proof of concepts, right? Let's start with the supply side. Again, rearmament policy in Europe really started from supply-side type policies. Not exclusively, but you read the kind of history, the inklings and seedlings of the current moment we're in, the current rearmament policies we face. These things really started emerging as R&D type policies, innovation type policies, things like that. And this is particularly a domain for which economists have built a lot of evidence around innovation and R&D policies, right? We're pretty certain, and I think it's uncontroversial. At one point it was controversial, but I think currently it's not controversial that these things have social returns, that there's large social returns to R&D investment. Claudia's work on this is seminal. I'm putting you on the spot, but this is seminal work on this, right? And at one time, these things were debated and contested. They still are. But I don't think it's controversial to say there's social returns to these things. And probably the social returns to innovation and R&D policy surely probably outweigh the private returns. There's a market failure here, and we have evidence of that. And the questions kind of posed around this are, well, does public R&D, defense R&D, such as the instruments we face now, do they crowd in or crowd out investment? Again, investment is a major linchpin in Draghi's cautionary tale and cautions posed to Europe. Do these things crowd in further R&D, further investment, crowd in private market activity, or do they crowd them out? And if you look at the history of industrial policy, in fact, specifically innovation policy, we used to say, oh, they probably crowded it out. If you think of a seminal industrial policy program from the US, the Small Business and Research Program, Innovation Research Program, itself started by Reagan. This is Reagan industrial policy. Reagan loved industrial policy. The first papers that studied this thing posed and said, hey, these things probably don't work. They probably crowd out industrial policy, maybe completely. The first inklings of evidence around these things. But let's take a step back and look at these programs. Again, this is a very, very important industrial policy in the US. It's industrial policy that has been copied by Europe, has inspired innovation policy in Europe. But it also hits at the kind of sweet spot and the exact issues that Europe faces. And the goal of this program is really to direct and channel US federal R&D spending to small and medium enterprise innovation. Right? There's a market failure for which really kind of early stage startup innovation is really hard to fund. It's risky. Let's give startups a chance and solve the market failures around early startup innovation and early kind of big swings, and let's fill that innovation and funding gap, right? And that was the impetus of this policy. And if we just look at the history of this policy, we see a lot of spillovers from it. We see, of course, failures, but we see successes too. The Roomba. I bought a Roomba. I bought a Roomba the other day. No, I really did. I bought a Roomba this last kind of Black Friday sale. This thing is a product of the SBIR policy. We don't realize it. And it's now kind of the most important or one of the leader in the market. It's being surpassed quickly by Chinese production in this world. But the Roomba started as a DoD, DARPA-funded, SBIR-funded project. It started as a PackBot. It started as something much more primitive looking than the PackBot. But in the 1990s, these were ideations. These were things that were kind of very speculative, right? These were a kooky guy at the MIT Media Lab had this idea to produce these types of things. It was a real cottage kind of production process. They benefited deeply in the 1990s from SBIR grants. Right? And funding things vis-a-vis DARPA and vis-a-vis the Small Business Administration to kind of take these initial moonshots. And they subsisted completely off these grants. So much so that actually, if you talk to the iRobot CEO, he says, no, we exist because of these grants. We exist because of these interventions, right? And when you actually look and decompose how this thing worked and how these policies work, when you trace them, again, now this is a publicly traded company. It's a giant company, huge market cap. But when you trace it, what it did was initially crowd in the early investment in early both private and VC capital, or private R&D and VC capital that kind of helped scale this technology and improve these technologies, later supported by a procurement drive by the US military, especially during the war on terror and the war in the Middle East. And that's what really gave birth to this type of thing. This is a product of the SBIR program, and this isn't unique. There's many products of this. There's many kind of spillovers and social spillovers that were produced by this program. And so actually, when we started, much like other pockets of industrial policy, when we started kind of looking at these policies just empirically, using just boring econometrics, just kind of tracing what are the effects of these things, we see that the pessimism around these policies, which we've said almost certainly probably crowd things out, actually probably don't. I think the emerging evidence around SBIR is actually pretty positive now. Not that we necessarily would create a Roomba from a pack buy, but the evidence shows us, just the more we kind of dig into these, which we are now, but it's fairly recent, how, for instance, looks at the Department of Energy SBIR program, very similar. There's about 11 agencies that run an SBIR program in the US. And if you look at the effects of these policies, again, these early kind of innovation grants given to small startups, small firms with speculative technologies, we find really positive effects in these things. There's a kind of textbook correction of an early market failure. If we think of just simple innovation, economic theory of market failures. We see that these things increase and kind of increase subsequent patenting, so it increases private R&D effort. Again, that's what the evidence says when we start actually looking at the numbers. It crowds in private investment. And you see that it increases output in things like revenue. And conditional on earning positive revenue, it increases the conditions and probability of earning positive revenue, also probably increases the probability of a good exit from the market, that is a spin-off or going public or being bought, in this case, by Amazon and others. It increases revenue, conditional and positive revenue, by about 30%. So we look at these things and we start actually taking the evidence at face value, not just rejecting these things as crowding out other investment. And we actually see, oh, the actual picture is much more nuanced here. In fact, if we kind of look at other dimensions of this policy, again, we see that it creates some crowding in. Again, not necessarily, but on average, right? There's crowding in from this leg of the project. We also see something also very important, and also a very important aspect of innovation policy. We see social spillovers. That if we actually look at how these patents or how these grants for innovation spill over into other firms, other industries, other technologically related firms in the same geographic region, that there's positive spillovers here too. So these aren't just internally born spillovers, that there's also spillovers across firms from these policies, to the extent that kind of a famous paper, Myers and Lonahan, AER, 2022, find that for every single patent that it crowds in from a private firm, from the firm targeted by these policies, it produces 3 extra patents outside of that firm. Right? Those are important social spillovers from policy. That's an important bang for our buck. That's an important kind of multiplier effect from these policies. That doesn't look like crowding out. It doesn't look like crowding out to me at all. It looks like something much different. I'm going to put Claudia on the spot again. I think the evidence has really gone from pessimism and kind of an outright rejection of these things to a cautious optimism. I say cautious optimism because we ought to be cautious with this evidence. But the evidence that is emerging is that R&D seems to, just on average, if we zoom out, if we put together all the evidence, all the reams of paper that have been published on this stuff, it seems to produce crowding in effects, whether a private R&D activity or private investment. Again, these are things that Draghi himself emphasizes we need here, right? The very things the very instruments that are targeting and part of the EU rearmament process are things by which that can create other social spillovers that are documented and facilitate those spillovers. And really, I think crowding out is the modal outcome of these policies, if we think about evidence. Again, it's not a foregone conclusion that these will produce crowding in. They will produce multiplier effects. There's deep heterogeneity that I'll talk about here. But again, when you just look at the evidence and kind of do the small, boring march through regressions, the evidence kind of tilts in the way that, an unexpected way, especially as empirical economists. And this is very recent. This is since I got my PhD that this kind of evidence has started to emerge. So does public and defense R&D work? I think it can. And again, the evidence is can. It's not guaranteed that it will. But again, this is Bloom, Van Reenen, and Williams. Heidi Williams over in Cambridge in the US. And we think of the policies that constitute, this is from their JEP piece, Journal of Economic Perspective piece, where they take a look at the kind of toolkit of innovation policy, specifically supply-side policy. We have kind of evidence of this now. And again, it went from a controversial statement in economics and innovation policy to say these things could be a major lever of industrial development to something now that we kind of accept there is pretty good evidence on. At least evidence to think about how do we best construct and best deploy these policies coherently. Right? And we think of the very policies like direct R&D grants and Pigouvian tax credits and fiscal policies, the types that are kind of wielded by the EU. Right? These things are things that for sure we have evidence on. For sure we have a degree and ability to make work properly and make work for larger social good and larger spillovers. In fact, that's the whole impetus of the literature, and that's what it's shown continually. Not because of a love of defense spending, but because of an appreciation for the spillovers and market failures that come with these types of policies. But what about the demand side? Right? We've really focused on the supply side. Again, how do we correct for market failures around the firm itself, the suppliers of stuff, the outputters, the producers, the market failures and kind of financial frictions for which they face? We have a lot of evidence there. But if we kind of just do a kind of step back and look at what the current state of EU rearmament looks like, in fact, what the state of a lot of defense rearmament looks like, is procurement policy, it's demand side. And there we have a lot less evidence, and there things are much more speculative, but only relatively so. I think there's practical importance around the import and thinking about the positive spillovers and positive effects and design of procurement policy. And there's a lot of scope for this. And thankfully, there's also a lot of emerging evidence from this. Not so much from economics proper, but from kind of fellow travelers and innovation studies and public policy studies and kind of engineers. And again, I focus on procurement because, of course, it's really important for rearmament. It's something we can't avoid, right? Draghi himself talks a lot about it. But of course, it's a linchpin of the rearmament policies here. The EU needed to create ammunition stockpiles and munitions capacity very, very quickly. Just like the UK in 1915. Right? These things are endemic. These kind of demand-side policies will be part of any kind of military buildup. And of course, as we see the evolution of EU industrial policy and military industrial policy, these things have become far more important than I imagined. If we kind of just do the bean counting and look at the levers that constitute this military drive, a lot of these are demand-side things now, right? We went from things that were very focused on the supply side before Ukraine, before February 2022, to things that are very explicitly demand-side procurement-led policies, things that are about centralizing procurement, organizing procurement, using procurement to spur innovation. So what does the evidence say around this? Again, we love supply-side stuff as economists, right? We love Pigouvian policies. We think they're very useful. We know less about the demand side, but we do know something. And we like the demand side actually if we start thinking about it, if we start kind of just thinking about this stuff theoretically. Why? It addresses kind of multiple things. It addresses both the issue of the kind of market failures around technology, but also the issues around capacity as well. Right? You can bundle those two things at once. You're improving and potentially contracting for increased capacity, which is something that we need direly, and something that is in high demand in moments of military buildup. Right? Even if the technology exists, even if it might be financeable, even if we could kind of fund it privately from our own firms, the market itself might not exist for these products, right? And of course, procurement creates a kind of a lead stable market that is less uncertain. Of course, it's a market prone to all sorts of things that we economists think about, hold up, a monopsony buyer, the issues around that. But there's potential here. And we just started kind of in the early 2000s taking those things seriously as industrial policy scholars. Let's take these things seriously. Let's start studying them kind of just as principled, boring economists and start thinking about their potential. And we have a hunch that defense industrial policy such as this and procurement might do stuff. Like, we have a hunch about that. Not merely because of Mariana Mazzucato and others who've talked about this, but just from our kind of lived experience, at least historically. Right? That these things are potentially market shaping, potentially transformative, potentially set the direction of industrial transformation, industrial development, and technological change. This is my parents' hometown of Cape Canaveral, Florida. Of course, a hometown of NASA, massive NASA procurement. And the emerging evidence here, again, this evidence is pretty new. We have a hunch that this stuff probably had an effect. I think it's hard to argue that NASA did nothing, right? When we start kind of measuring the effects of these big episodes, whether it's NASA, whether it's World War II, we do find that these things probably led to a massive concentration, a large concentration of economic activity, and was direction setting. Gross and Stampat 2023 is a great example from AER. The crisis innovation around World War II, specifically the OSRD office, which is something they study, they find really positive effects on this stuff, especially in long-term clustering. They said this led to a surge in wartime patenting and also propelled innovation hubs that fostered post-war discoveries and were related to subsequent employment growth. Again, this isn't granular, but it's long run. And the course evidence here points to this stuff having an effect. Of course, paying dividends in the future, but to earn dividends and to accumulate dividends, you need time. So long run things. And it's not merely World War II, right? It's not merely an exotic episode like this. We see the space race, Cantor-Whaley, 2025 actually now. Draka's famous study on the Reagan military buildup. There's evidence that these things were agenda setting. There's evidence in all these papers that these contracts and procurement drives did facilitate something. In particular, they didn't seem to crowd things in. They didn't seem to crowd things out. They seemed to crowd in investment. They seemed to be positive for productivity and output and private provisioning of innovative activity after the fact. Again, we think we have this hint that this stuff worked. And in the aggregate, we think this stuff works, or it did something. If we get more granular and think about things like the relationship between procurement and private company R&D in contemporary times, we see a positive relationship between the share of high-tech innovation components in R&D spending and the extent to which firm invests in private R&D themselves. So we see this kind of issue and this outcome of crowding in when we drill down and get more granular and get more detailed and get further away from thinking about long run, thinking more about the medium run. When we look at the medium run evidence, this stuff seems to be doing something. Again, this isn't to say it will always work, but it seems to be doing something. So what does the micro evidence say? Because that's something we're really concerned with, right? This is a kind of like, not necessarily correlational, this is like large kind of aggregate arguments for maybe this policy having an effect. These are proof of concepts. But when we drill down, we start seeing evidence of these things, the incremental evidence around these policies having an effect. And I'd say if I could characterize and go out on a limb to show what procurement policy seems to do, it seems to have a positive effect on innovation, a significant one. Again, if we collect all that evidence, do that slow march through evidence and econometric studies, it seems to have a positive effect. It seems to increase crowding in, but it does so incrementally, right? And if we start thinking about how procurement works, that kind of makes sense to us. The Rearmament Raven is probably the most successful small-scale drone that we have, right? It became the standard. It became the standard around the Iraq War. It became a massive export. It was a massive success, right? It was a massive innovative success, right? Became one of the most used small-scale drones around the world. It defined drone combat, especially during the War on Terror, especially in the early years of the 2000s and 2010s. They are still in use today. These things are the product of military procurement. That might seem obvious, but it's not so much obvious in retrospect, right? And these things started off as, these technologies existed, right? These drone technologies existed. They had things like the pointer, the flashlight, these predecessor technologies in the late 90s, early 2000s. This technology did exist. In fact, this technology was funded by those very grants I talked about. SBIR type grants, DARPA, things like that. They helped facilitate the early kind of inklings of these technologies, these early proof of concepts. But it was, and they produced kind of models here and there, maybe under 50 units, right? Today we have over 20,000 units. But what really propelled the innovations here, the slow incremental innovations from the pointer and flashlight, which did exist, to these kind of robust, standardized, kind of core piece of modern warcraft, was really military procurement and the small incremental processes and innovation that those facilitated, right? So there's, of course, a huge demand shock that occurred along these things in 2022, 2005. We all know that. If we think of defense spending in the US, there's a huge shock and huge sudden demand for these types of products and these types of military hardware. They won a massive kind of competition from the Department of Defense and the Air Force, and allowed them to scale this stuff very, very quickly, and led to successive rounds of innovation improvements on these products, and led to them being the standard kind of linchpin of drone warfare. And it's hard to think about that process as occurring without that military procurement really facilitating that process, right? Just to illustrate that procurement has an effect. It has these scale effects that are very important. You can track many products, not just these, not just the kind of modern experience of the Raven. Many things started this way. The technology exists, but we have to go through the rock tumbler of procurement, the incremental design facilitation that the procurement process gives us, to making these things sophisticated standards. And what we think that procurement does is it helps kind of facilitate that incremental type of innovation and that type of adoption and diffusion. That's particularly where it's very, very useful. And that's what evidence tells us. This isn't just epiphenomenal. This isn't me making things up. If we kind of collate the evidence, again, do the march through papers that exist, we do see here, too, a positive effect. It's not guaranteed. But if we march through the evidence, we see a positive effect of these demand-side policies. High-tech procurement seems to actually create more industrial innovation. It leads to industrial development. And it seems robust across economies, right? But of course, it's not going to often create new innovations that are completely unforeseen and new to the market. These products have to exist in some dimension in order to procure them in the first place, in order to win a procurement contract. And there's evidence that these things are kind of complementary to supply-side policies and often bundled with them. But again, just like supply-side policy, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. There's positive effects of these things. Again, if we kind of do the bean counting and march through the empirical work, we think these things on average work or have a positive effect at least in the aggregate. But underneath that is a lot of heterogeneity. And I'll get to that in a minute. Because that heterogeneity itself kind of implies some lessons to be taken from this and some lessons to be learned from the experience of defense industrial policy, specifically innovation policy. What are those emerging lessons? Let's start with the heterogeneity I talked about. And I want to pose a question, and this is just me being antagonistic and controversial. Does horizontalism make sense? Especially if we start looking at the sources of the heterogeneity and we start looking at that literature I just talked about. Again, recall something I said. If you look at this literature, both the supply side, demand side, you see a lot of heterogeneity in things. We see kind of a positive effect on average, but we see things vary a lot. We see effects vary a lot. Effects seem to be larger on average for certain types of firms versus others. What does that tell us about horizontalism? We're very much wedded to this idea that we should target horizontally. That's kind of almost a first principle of design. We get interviewed by the media or people on facilitating industrial policy design. We say, for no question, we should do things horizontally first. But if you look at the heterogeneity in the literature, you see things like, again, across supply side and demand side, you see kind of things that rhyme. You see strong parallels between both sides of these literatures, both these types of instruments. You see stronger effects for younger firms on average, stronger effects for smaller firms on average. See, these things can be very, very potent for early startups. You see, they are probably particularly strong for financially constrained firms. We think no matter what the market failure that's dominant, that these things and policies that facilitate and relax the financial constraint of firms really, really help. And thus we see kind of a real bang for your buck and larger effects for financially constrained enterprises. Okay. We see a lot of variation in the maturity of different technologies. Some policies, there's no scope to get into that now, but depending on kind of how mature technology is, there might be different complementaries and different instruments that we should target them with. We have all this variation. I'm not saying this because I love regurgitating facts to you. I'm not saying this because I love heterogeneity for its own sake. I'm saying this because, well, if we're so attached to horizontalism, if we think spillovers vary, if we think the effects vary, is that an argument for horizontalism? Is that an argument for actually being very judicious with the way we target? Is that an argument for actually thinking about spillovers and market failures in the way we design things? And I think it does. I think it kind of changes the way. Once you start unpacking and getting granular with this evidence, I think it shifts kind of how we ought to target. In fact, implores us to target if we want to really target things for which we think there's large social benefits and large spillovers. We should expect lags. Again, this stuff takes a long time. Many of the policies I talked about, not only these policies about moonshots and the long-run effects of World War II, we know those are long-run stuff, but even kind of the firm-level studies, these effects take a long time, especially when we're talking about R&D and technologies and things like comparative advantage. Comparative advantage takes a long time to emerge. And so we should be judicious with the design of these things and how we evaluate them. And this came up a lot from my experience with Biden administration and the kind of recent experience with other industrial policies, is that we're really short and we really rush to judgment when we evaluate and declare things failures often. You can go back and look at editorial piece after editorial piece on Chinese industrial policy and find many people who will tell you unblinkingly straight to your face that these policies are a failure and there's nothing to worry about. And unflinchingly said that to you, right? Of course they weren't. I mean, maybe there were failures in some dimensions, but we're surely having to grapple with them now when people told us these things are nothing to worry about. These things evolve, they're dynamic, and by definition they're dynamic, and we should kind of appreciate that the effects take time to accumulate, and we should not rush to judgment to evaluate these things. We should evaluate them over a longer horizon. As the whole argument for these things is that we ought to see effects dynamically accrue through time. And you would see this with Biden's industrial policy, the chips. People, right after the industrial policy was signed, people would be like, oh, look at this, we're not exporting chips. But it's like a fab takes 2 to 5 years to build. The shovels haven't even hit the ground yet. And so discourse really needs to be tempered by, and expectations need to be tempered by, the long-run nature of these policies, especially with respect to the political business cycle. Again, this is straight from what I teach in class. Right? If we just accept the most boring kind of model of industrial policy, of learning curves, that we should start at A and move to B. In a theoretical world, we should move down that learning curve. We should accrue by learning experience, by gaining the dynamic gains from production and realizing those dynamic gains. We will eventually merge to B and become internationally competitive. Again, something we teach in trade, undergraduate trade class, right? We're often evaluating things at A, right? And you would see all sorts of articles about, look at TSMC, they're really bad at this stuff. We just built this TMC plant. Look how bad they are making things. Of course, they should be. We should be bad at things at first, right? That's the whole theory, that's the whole point, is it takes time to produce these things, and within very quick time, you see TSMC, the headlines completely changed. And we forget these things. I think you can see these same things when it comes to kind of our evaluation and our arrogance around Chinese industrial policies. Oh, look at how much these things are kind of wasteful and aren't working. And they're wasteful and not working until they're here, until they're truly affecting us. And so there's a guide to kind of look at intermediate outcomes that are just important. And that's what the Biden administration learned, of course, too late, that we should appreciate the boring small stuff in the interim. We should appreciate that these things are working, the investment is occurring, the things and more proximate outcomes are actually moving in the direction they ought to move. I used to think this was boring, kind of pedantic policy stuff, but it was really everything. Understanding the short-run gains are really, really important to telling us and giving us a weather vane for what might happen in the future, because these are necessarily longer-run policies. Again, another meta lesson is that administrative capacity is everything. I just seem to think it's everything. If you read and decompose any policies, we abstract away from a lot of this stuff in these econometric studies. That conditional on these things working are a lot of investment in capacity, in bureaucratic capacity making. And this isn't a political statement, this is an empirical statement. It's hard to look at any policy. It's hard to find any success with industrial policy, innovation policy, where there wasn't a lot of appreciation and investment in the skills underlying it. The boring kind of bureaucracy and institutional design and organizational design of making these things work and function. And that's something we often completely abstract away from. And I think it's often what really determines the success and failures of these policies if we zoom out and are comparativists and look at what are the functions or what are the variables that determine success and failure? What are the variables that determine that heterogeneity in success and failure? I think underlying it, this would be a smoking gun. So this is merely a hunch, but this is a hunch I think that's kind of well theorized. Right? Because if you start asking people questions, you start doing kind of the boring shoe leather of thinking about what matters most when it comes to innovation policy. You start asking firms, what helps you the most? What are your biggest bottlenecks? They point a lot to, of course, market failures, huge issue, but the boring kind of procurement staff, the skills of the staff, the ability of the staff to do stuff, their knowledge base. Because we're talking about technology. Like, these things are complicated. We're talking about very kind of complex technologies often when it comes to military equipment. You need staff that recognizes and understands these things. Of course, the procurement body here is quite advanced. You're too advanced. These things are very, very important and instrumental. But investing in state capacity, and especially administrative capacity, I've not seen any policy work that didn't appreciate a large investment here. I hope it's something that the EU is currently pursuing with their policies, because I think it's completely instrumental. Again, it's a bottleneck that shows up in survey after survey when we start doing that hard work of thinking about how do these things work, how do they actually function. I think there's the largest kind of unrealized returns to investing in these types of things. But yet it's the things that often go completely underexplored. Of course, people like Philip and others are exploring it in their research agenda. I think the bureaucracy and workings of these things are absolutely essential. And we will see how essential it is, because these are particularly, if we just look at the literature, what they emphasize kind of training these people, retaining them, and kind of facilitating their workloads, things like that. And it's the opposite of what the US is doing right now. Again, this is merely an empirical statement. This isn't me trying to be controversial. It's an empirical statement that DOGE is particularly targeting the procurement staff across the federal government in the US. And he's targeting them in ways that are almost built. They're almost built to kind of undermine technology spillovers and innovation. Again, if we look at exact papers on the federal government and the administration, we find just empirical evidence that things like workload have huge ramifications for bottlenecks in technological adoption, that they actually translate to material outcomes, they translate to innovation. And this is exact staff that's being targeted by the current layoffs and the current kind of DOGE momentum, which has already faded. But I think this is a kind of human capital that we've lost in the US. It will be very, very hard to regain. I think it's a mistake to pursue these types of policies. And I think it's also kind of an empirical natural experiment on what we should not do and what Europe should not do, and an impulse we should constrain ourselves from pursuing. Again, this is a political statement. It's isomorphic to the evidence that we have around best practice. And if we think about the best practice around innovation, innovation policy entails a lot of flexibility and delegation. Again, I won't get into the specifics of how we should design contracts, how should we design the kind of principal agent problems, how we should design the technicalities of auctions. There's literatures on that, right? But we think the meta principles guiding good design, good defense industrial policy, they come down to having a lot of flexibility, having a lot of delegation. It's the things that imbue every kind of best practice that the OECD puts out around innovation policy. We need to delegate. We need staff that's flexible. We need to have staff that's able to kind of not over-specify rules, and it's able to kind of delegate the design process at a more granular level. Of course, these things are all antithetical to retrenching an administrative state and underinvesting and de-investing and kind of pursuing completely undermining the kind of public service and civil service. The exact things that we emphasize in best practice when it comes to contract design are very much the things that are downstream from the current cuts in administrative capacity and investing in it. I just got the sign that I should wrap up now, but really that's it in a nutshell. So if I were to kind of put a bow on what I'm trying to say, is this, is that this isn't just rearmament policy. And no industrial policy is merely rearmament policy. All rearmament policy is industrial policy. And that's not me being kind of capricious. That's true if you just think about what industrial policy is. And so we're at an odd moment right now where these policies are really, truly kind of being articulated as hard industrial policies, but it's a moment where we have evidence around these policies particularly producing social spillovers to addressing these issues that Draghi talks about. We are kind of at a vantage point where we can design policies to address the kind of economic issues that face Europe. And we're particularly well positioned to do that. But this isn't a foregone conclusion. This is not so much an economic kind of lesson. The real battle will be the political battle around kind of facilitating these industrial policies working. And that's the main issue that underlies this. So yes, there's a potential to address these things. And I'll stop there.
So thank you very much, Nathan. We suggest that we collect 2 to 3 questions, and then you can answer them.
Hi, thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. Your definition of industrial policy states that it's about transforming the structure of economic activity. I think at least what I'm observing in Germany in political practice is maybe implicit in it, but not explicit, because it's a lot of the debate is about maintaining the structural economic structure amidst geopolitical pressures, external pressures. Mm-hmm. You talked a lot about kind of growing niches, growing new industries. Do you have something to say about the prospects of the other part of the maintaining economic structures amidst pressures?
Nathan, thanks so much for this fantastic overview. My question is kind of a statement, but like open-ended, so you please push back. So I take away 2 things. First is, in the defense space, you would make an argument there's room for industrial policy to accelerate R&D. And that's a classic argument I think most people in the room would agree with. Second is, and having people from the ministry here, I think that's something I've been trying hard, not very successfully, to get into people's heads, is there is a case for industrial policy because of, I don't know if this is the right word, but broadly speaking, we need to plan for capacity.
Yes.
In defense, and so we should contract and procure not on quantity, which is what we do right now, but on capacity. So anything if you want to tell us how to do that, because I think there's a very crucial point that there's no incentive for private industry to invest in capacities that are only needed in case of war,
Surge, yeah.
Whereas there's a huge social value in having these capacities ready. And also, like, to the extent that there's a deterrence also in having these capacities, it actually makes the case even stronger, because no one has an incentive in building something that deters the war, so it doesn't really, you never need these capacities in the first place. So these 2, I think, these 2 points I'm totally on board with. What is and maybe this is the point where you could be a little bit more specific, what's the point where there's like directed technological change that you think can be engineered when we think about building, so to some extent we know what Europe lacks, how do we get
Exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, and last point about state capacity, I think I said this earlier, we spend like 15% of GDP in Western societies on public procurement, and we have no idea, we have very little idea how to get this right and how to do it, and we need the best people doing this, but we have also on the economic side, we haven't done enough.
That's right.
Thank you very much for your insights. Me coming from Brussels here today, I would have one question on your very initial slide, I think, on the European Defence Industrial Programme, which last year ended on my table. We were discussing should it be with the security colleagues or with me on economics. Security colleague quit, so it was with me. And writing that study, and I think it might be a bit of a crucial point for what you said now, what we realized really quickly is that a lot of things that you mentioned why defense industrial policy can be so efficient is based on state capacity, which we do not have on a European level. And then it boiled back down to the question, would that be an efficient thing to do in Europe if we lack the state capacity?
Yes. So, actually, I'll start from there. So, again, I think a lot of this can sometimes be beside the point, right? Because I think we should think about policymaking working in terms of the political and governance constraints that face us. And we need to be very clear about articulating those. Those are something I do in the paper and think very hard about. But I think those things are like, I actually think those things are everything. And just as an outside observer and as someone who's ignorant, what I see in the current experience in the EU is heartening in some ways, and that might be kind of surprising to hear. You might have a more pessimistic view. But as an outsider, I didn't think that there would be kind of institutions evolving to deal with and reconcile some of these issues around centralization of procurement. Or, in fact, building and kind of being able to deploy some of these industrial policies in a coordinated way. And I think there's something really, really important about military shocks in general when it comes to state capacity. Of course, we know we have the literature that says, okay, these things seem to do something when it comes to state capacity, but I think they do something more important when it comes to properly doing industrial policy. There's a reason why South Korea did my work on South Korea. Korea was able to do industrial policy, I think primarily because they were able to overcome the political constraints that previously kind of very much constrained them. Because they were in a very particular moment. They had to go it alone, in fact, without the US. They were being strategically jettisoned from the US and the kind of Western allyship. And that spun them into a whole different political equilibrium they had to design around. And so this is to say, I think we're in a very important moment where there are political spillovers to what's happening when it comes to the military moment in ways that I find interesting and hopeful. But I think the binding condition on all of this will be these exact constraints that you're talking about. But I'm kind of cautiously optimistic because I thought these weren't things that would ever be addressed in the ways that they're being addressed now. And right, we see that in the evolution of policy, how tepid it was just like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to how kind of much more robust it is, to the fact that it's actually addressing some of these constraints, which did catch me off guard because I'm cynical. I'm a pessimist. I'm a pessimistic person. But I'm kind of hopeful there. So but that's to say, governance and political economy constraints are everything. We ought to design around them. We ought to design conditional on them. And sometimes, I think that's why horizontalism in some policies are actually probably pretty good. Because in lieu of not having those types of capacities, we ought to think about design. We ought to design for the system we have, not the system we want. Yeah. And so, when it comes to the issues of capacity, this is something I did ignore here. It's in the paper. It's something I talk a lot about because it comes down to kind of these nitty-gritty details of almost mechanism design and auction design. And what's weird is there's a lot of it lurking in the literature. There's a lot of solutions there. There's a lot of discussion there. It's not just it's not always posed by economists, oddly enough. It's kind of posed by the technicians. But it's something for which I think we have good evidence and good theories and good ideas around how to design these things, how to bundle them. In fact, some of the people I cite have very, very good evidence around there. And so it's something I'm consciously ignoring for this audience, but it's something I think is like really, really fundamental. But I think it's something for which we actually have a body of evidence around, and a body of evidence that we can actually speak to, and speak to very, very directly. It's really boring, but it's like, I think it's totally essential. But it's also an area where we have some legibility and have some lessons. And your next question was what? The second one, the last thing you asked was what? I forgot.
It was the state capacity, whether you
Yeah. And what was the other question?
Industrial policy for maintaining.
Yes. This is, again, something I consciously kind of avoided, but I think it's something that's super important here. And I do think industrial policy is often about correcting the declines in which people are facing, the declines, the kind of structural declines and sunsets that economies face. And so I think it does fit into kind of this kind of loose principle definition, this ex ante definition we have, is that those are very much things that are front of mind. And I think it's very often the case that we target industrial policy to industries that we face that they're under attack. And you kind of see that in the data. The industries that kind of get the most industrial policy are actually industries for which countries tend to have a comparative advantage. And I would argue probably are losing comparative advantage globally. And so I think that's the kind of big question. And I think that's where we have the least evidence as to how can we deploy industrial policy in ways, especially here, in ways that can facilitate kind of holding up or kind of like addressing these structural issues that face like the automotive industry here. We do have some evidence. Philip and I have evidence on Vietnam War procurement, Korean War procurement. The Korean War episode, the procurement episode from its effect on Japan, for instance. It had an amazing effect on reviving these weird companies that were failing, one called Suzuki, one called Toyota. And it completely saved them. That's not to say it's a complete parable or a complete kind of analogy or at all isomorphic. But there is some evidence here. There is kind of anecdotes here, but there's not a lot of evidence. It's something I really want to work on because I think it's pressing, especially for the US. So that's an empty-handed answer, other than to say I think it's really important. Yeah.
It's more work for us.
Yeah, more work. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Nathan.
Thanks a lot.